So today's cafe, we want to welcome Professor Brian Schoen from Department of History and Professor Tim Anderson from the Department of Geography. And they wrote this nice book called Settling Ohio. I'll have to say I've read most of it. I haven't read it all. I've read most of it. And also, Little Professor has set up a table. If you haven't got your copy yet, I'm sure they'll be willing to provide you with one. And so they're presenting today on their book, Settling Ohio, First Peoples and Beyond. And so let's please welcome Professor Schoen and Professor Anderson.
Thanks so much, Harold. Thanks so much, Howard. Really appreciate it. So it's exciting to be here. Thank you all for coming. And Brian and I today wanted to talk about our book, Settling Ohio, which we co-edited just a year ago, right? Just came out about May of 20...
A little over a year ago.
Yeah, a little over a year ago. A bit about the origin of the book. Brian and I were at a conference on Midwestern history in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in 2020, I think? Yeah. And David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, had just come out. And that was quite the conversation at that meeting. And some of the conversation was not all that positive, yeah, to say the least. A lot of folks were talking about that book there, and that got us to thinking, right? We were talking about this, and in the end, a long story short, we convened a conference here at OU, and the authors, all but one of the presenters of that conference, agreed to write a chapter for the book. And so the book is really trying to tell more of that story that David McCullough covers in The Pioneers. We began from the premise that who were really the first pioneers in Ohio? Was it the New Englanders who came to Marietta, or was it perhaps people who were here long before them? So that was sort of the impetus of the book. From there, we contracted with OU Press, and they did a fabulous job with this. And this is the cover of the book here. So
got Jeff over here, I will say, should take some credit for his help in this book as well. So
how many of you all have seen this painting? Yeah? A history book, or this is the famous painting American Progress by the artist John Gast from 1872. And I'll throw out some questions. What do you see when you see this? What are some of the images? What in terms of iconography do you see in this painting? What do you think the artist was trying to convey? And with thinking that remembering that this was painted in 1872. Any ideas? Yeah.
Westward expansion.
Right, so westward expansion, yeah, that's one. Any other images or like a discourse that is kind of communicated here?
White saviors. White saviors.
Yeah, white saviors, yeah. Saviors of whom? Yeah. Yeah, so there's lots of images here, right? Here's this idea of that I think it could be argued, and many historians have argued, is buried deep in the American psyche of this westward expansion. What's the term that we used to describe that? Right, manifest destiny, right? That idea, that term comes from. John O'Sullivan, who's the editor of the United States Magazine and Democratic Review. And I think actually he wrote something even before this where he uses kind of those terms. But this was in an editorial in that magazine from 1845. And I've kind of highlighted some of the big words, right, that I think loom large in our in our American Western history. A mission, a destiny, immutable truth, right? What's the immutable truth? That the United States is not just another country, right? But a country with a mission, right? A mission to spread what? Civilization, right? Or their ideas of civilization, destined to the great nation of futurity. America is chosen, right, by God Himself. So this is this image, these sets of images that I think are, as I said, deep in our our national consciousness. But like any kind of set of ideals, there's another set of ideals that we might call, mythology. These are kind of mythic images, right? Big ideas, big ideals. And so one way of thinking about this that Brian and I have discussed is thinking about kind of deconstructing these myths, kind of busting these myths, if you will, asking serious questions about them. So we, one of the ideas, one of the myths that we could kind of start with was, if we look at that painting, is maybe asking ourselves, well, by whom was civilization brought to the American frontier and from where? So what is the answer to that we are often confronted with? Anyone? What are the answers to that?
Okay.
Yeah, and you can be
Europeans.
politically incorrect, right? What are the answers that we are all taught, right? Really from as young children, that it was Europeans, right, who brought civilization, and it was from east to west, right? I don't know about you, but my American history professor in high school was the football coach, and it was kind of a limited version of this, but I know that the ideal in my head was that civilization proceeded from east to west, from Europe across the Atlantic and then to the Pacific, right? And it was this wave of settlers going west, right?
I mean, you can
Just
even
like
see it
that.
here in the image, right? If we think about our cardinal directions, that's what's happening here is the sort of the sweep of migration from the east, from the coast here, this very condensed, I guess, continent that we're, through to the other side of the coast. At a time when the frontier, as it was referred to then, was kind of closing, right? It seemed to be maybe closing, but still was very active and lots of activity happening there, right? With some of the other imagery in here, right? There's the railroads, the telegraph. These are the signs of technology, the signs of progress. And these were the signs of technology and were the signs of progress, right? This isn't purely myth-making, but the assumption that it leads to is that this is how civilization moves, and it's embedded in some ways in McAuliffe's own approach.
Yeah, so these are some of the ideas we wanted to, that we asked our authors to discuss, right, in their, during the conference and then in the chapters in the book, is to kind of rethink some of these idealized versions of events. Yes?
If you go back to the picture, is that a sunset or a sunrise? Because if it's a sunset, aren't they going in the wrong direction?
I think it's probably supposed to be a sunrise.
Is what our
Yeah,
assumption is,
yeah.
but
Yeah. Either that or John Gass had
Does anybody know where
Messed up
John
view.
Gast was from? Does anybody know who this, it's always interesting when we think about artwork or we think about these portrayals, like who are the people who are presenting this? Anybody know anything about this guy, John Gast, or where this painting is? No? So John Gast was born in Berlin, not Berlin, Ohio, right? Berlin, Germany. And his family migrated to central Missouri, wine country, helped cultivating wine in central Missouri. I stop and get some every once in a while when I head back from Arkansas. It's not the best wine. But so this is an immigrant. Anybody know where John L. O'Sullivan was originally from? The name gives you a little bit of a hint. Oh yeah, Ireland, right? So that's also just an interesting little fact here. Like these are people who are new to the United States, who are embracing this image right? And projecting it onto what their own experiences is. Because I think one of the important parts of this, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is how diverse the groups are who do decide to come to places like Ohio.
Are there images of American Indians in there? It's hard to see, or is it strictly?
Yes,
Yeah, right here.
Right,
yeah.
just right there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here in the darkness.
In the dark.
In the darkness,
That's
and
the-
they're
that's
fleeing,
the image.
right?
And they're
fleeing.
They're fleeing, and
Yeah.
and the image is one of light coming from the east, you know, and those in the darkness are kind of running away. Another classic portrayal of this is the baptism of Pocahontas, which is in Washington D.C. in the Capitol, and you know the light is there, and all of the indigenous people are sort of in the dark, scary, looming individuals that were seen as a threat, as this one maybe is a little bit portraying. This picture is actually in Los Angeles at the Gene Autry Museum, which is dedicated to Western history. So, back to you. Tim.
Yeah, no. You know, if you want to go back to that map there, you know, if you think about, you know, who were the first pioneers, they were the indigenous populations, who, according to most anthropologists and archaeologists, the standard theory, according to that evidence, is that this occurred roughly around 20,000 years ago from what's now Siberia and Eastern Asia, through that, over that land bridge, and then down into the continent, and then of course all the way to the tip of South America. Here's a population that was really on the move and that populated an immense area from Alaska to the tip of South America. And in doing so, as those populations moved and migrated, and some stayed and some left, and some went here and some went there, the languages diverged, such that by the Columbian contact in the late 15th century, there were some 300 different languages, at least, in what's now the United States alone, in 12 different language families. So that means that some of those languages were as different as, and this is not hyperbolic, as different as Mandarin Chinese and English, right? So this happened over a long period of time, and it led to a lot of diversity of different kinds of many different cultures, many different cultural ideals scattered through here. And they left behind in the cultural landscape that we can see all around us, especially in Ohio, we can see if you want to go to the next slide there, we can see the results of that modification of the natural environment, right, into a cultural landscape. This is from a very famous archaeological survey by Squire and Davis from the 1830s and 40s, where they mapped out all of these Hopewell and Adena earthworks throughout the Ohio Valley. This is now a golf course, right? Although it has just now been transferred back to the property of the Ohio History Connection, and this is the world's latest UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Site. That, along with a few other sites, if you want to go to the next slide, Brian, like Serpent Mound and the Mound City Group over at Chillicothe, and then mounds all over the place, right? Does anyone know where this one is? That's just up the road. That's in the plains.
Where there's a festival that happens.
There's right,
annually.
yeah. And in these mounds, some of which were burial mounds, some of which were obviously ceremonial, like Serpent Mound, have been found all sorts of really amazing relics, like this copper falcon. Or a raptor, I guess is what it's supposed to be, made out of copper. And that copper didn't come from here, that came from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They've also found ceremonial goods made out of shark's teeth. Last time I checked, there were no sharks in central Ohio. So what's that preclude, right? Or what's that show? That shows evidence, one, of division of labor, right? That's what any archaeologist or anthropologist would tell you. Someone's building this, and someone's directing that labor to build all these things. These things are large and big. So it reflects a stratification in society. And it also reflects, with these types of goods, trade, sometimes over long, long distances, right? So who were the first, quote unquote, civilized people? Is this not civilization? So a significant modification of the cultural landscape.
Sorry.
Yeah, so an immense amount of cultural diversity was encountered by the first Europeans and then Euro-Americans as they moved west. Lots of different linguistic distinctions and lots of different language families, right? These are just language families. And this is amazing because this was among a population, probably most scholars think at most about 3 million, right? So the most scholars believe that from what's now Alaska to what's now the Rio Grande or whatever, about 3 million people. So in other words, there are only 3 million people speaking languages in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7 different language families. So that is a lot of cultural diversity there. So this is what's encounters, right? So the first European settlers and Euro-American settlers encountered these landscapes everywhere, but in the Ohio Valley, they encountered these landscapes, right, that clearly had been modified by indigenous populations. Yeah, so that brings us to another question with regard to kind of myth busting, and that is, if you go to the next slide, and then maybe we can, actually the next one, I think, yeah, and then we can come back to those two slides. And that is that the myth that indigenous peoples were, quote unquote, uncivilized, that with little agency. And you know what I mean by agency? Right, so with no kind of power to either interact with or to counteract European and Euro-American advances on their claimed homeland territories. So that's another myth that we wanted to kind of address in the book. And Brian, I don't know if you want to discuss some of that.
One of the things to kind of think about, and that I think it's easy from multiple perspectives, is to homogenize these groups. And as Tim just beautifully illustrated, these were remarkably diverse groups of people. And the reality is that European and white Americans who encountered those people had to confront that diversity. They were aware of it. They were aware of it probably in ways that are like more aware of it than we are, right? If you look at the sources, they know the nuances because they have to engage and interact with these groups of people. And that is in part because of what the geopolitics of North America looked like in the late 18th and early 19th century, which is the period that our book kind of covers. And so this is just a generic map that you would find in any U.S. history textbook about North America in 1754, right? And so let's just pretend that you're standing here in 1754 and you're saying, there's an early version of all these betting sites that are there, and you're like, all right, I've got to put my money on who's going to control what we now call Ohio, right? Who are you betting on in the 1750s as controlling where we are now, as like claiming it as part of their land? The French probably, they're the ones that claim control of it by treaties in Europe, right? The British are here. They're kind of moving in. George Washington and his men are sort of eyeing the land here, thinking maybe they're going to speculate in it. The Spanish are pretty close too, and they had kind of pushed up into Louisiana in some of these areas and eventually would briefly kind of control it. But the people who really controlled it, right, the ones who actually were there, who occupied the space in 1750, were none of those European groups, outside of a few traders who were coming around doing business. It was this constellation of different speakers, Iroquois, Delaware, Lenape, Shawnee, who were themselves, some of them, recent migrants into this region, right? Ohio has always been kind of this pass-through thoroughfare, and that was very true at this time. And so one of the authors in the book, his chapter kind of just, this wasn't even seen as Indian country. That's what we may call it. It was seen as Lenape or Delaware or Miami or Wyandotte. And all of these different linguistic groups were competing with one another well before Europeans arrived, right? And as Europeans arrived, we're continuing to compete with one another, figuring out how it is that they could best utilize their interaction with European peoples, right? They, in other words, kind of were in some degree of control in this area, carving out a place for themselves, even as these European powers were there. They were active agents, in other words, of trying to sort out the best future that they possibly could.
So were they friendly with each other, or did they have their own disputes? How
They
did
had their own
define
disputes.
boundaries between them?
Yeah, this is another myth, right? And I was up in Canada where I was last fall, and I went on a tour from a very nice tour guide who said, much to the historians who were there as sort of horror, before Europeans arrived, there was no war or conflict between indigenous peoples. Right? Well, sadly, right, indigenous peoples are just like European peoples were in Europe, and they were fighting in Europe, and they were fighting in North America, because it seems to be something that certainly back then was a common occurrence. And so there were friendly alliances that were formed, and there were competitions, and in fact, the mobility of a lot of the indigenous people was forced on them by some of the fighting that happened. Now, guess what Europeans bring into the mix that changes how warfare happens? Weapons, that's right, guns, right? And you want to connect with those groups who can best provide you the arms you need to defeat your enemies, right? And the English, the French initially aren't willing to sell. The English eventually do. The Dutch are quite happy to sell in New York. And so it sort of transforms a lot of these societies. One of the most interesting things, I think, that evidences this agency that indigenous peoples have at this period is the development of what some people think was the largest city in the Ohio Valley, which was not a European-based city, but what is now Piqua, where lots of indigenous groups sort of created trading posts that Europeans would come and sell their goods to, right? And that there was a constellation of different people who came and did business and exchanged and interacted with one another, right? So what did the late 18th century kind of look like? Well, as the title of our book says, it's not what that first image was, right? With indigenous peoples in the dark fleeing. It was a place in which the only way that Europeans could get what their goals were, which was more land, was to do business with the indigenous people. And so this is Tim had this great, brilliant insight to make this the cover of our book. And I think it illustrates what we want this book to demonstrate, which is that the story of late 18th and early 19th century Ohio Valley is one where you have to think about the indigenous peoples and the Europeans as having to negotiate and contest this space, right? In certain instances as almost equals, even though the dynamic is shifting, as the book also shows. Do you want to explain more about the picture?
Yeah, I can say just a few words about it. Yeah, this picture actually it's a painting that hangs in the Chicago History Museum. and it's about so big. And it actually doesn't even have a title, and we don't know who the artist was. It usually goes by the title Negotiations for the Treaty of Greenville. So the Treaty of Greenville happened about 3 months after this. And that's the treaty that basically the coalition of different indigenous groups, here you see Little Turtle, the Miami chief, and a number of others. There were several others that aren't here at this negotiation, that are not in the painting, but they met to kind of talk about what was going to happen and what was going to happen as a result of this treaty. And so that Treaty of Greenville that was signed about 3 months after this, in essence, ceded these Indian groups ceded about the northwest 2/3 of what's now Ohio to the the southeast 2/3 of the state to the federal government, and in exchange for what in essence were reservation lands in the northwest quarter of the state, and I'll talk more about that treaty line and what that meant later. But here you see these negotiations taking place, right? And there's some important people here. One of the things I love about this painting is this guy here, William Wells. So what's he doing in the painting?
It's hard to see.
Yeah, he's down on one
Looks
knee.
like he's praying.
Yeah,
But
he's writing, right? So he's writing down what's going on, what's being said between the negotiators.
I mean, how did they even talk to each other?
Well,
that's a great question.
That's a great
and
question.
The answer there is William Wells, in part because William Wells was born in Kentucky, or his family lived in Kentucky, and during a raid, so one of the common practices during Indian warfare was if you attacked somebody, you would claim the captures or hostages, and they would be used to replenish the losses that you may have had. And William Wells was basically brought into Little Turtle's nation, and in fact married one of his daughters, right, and lived and was raised in part by Little Turtle, right, by this Miami or Miami chief. Now, it becomes very interesting because he reconnects with his Kentucky family, and he is playing both sides, we know, during some of this. But he's what some people would call a cultural broker. He's somebody who knows both languages, right? And so William Wells is here, by this point in this enduring conflict, and incidentally, it's worth remembering, the first two military engagements of the United States were not military victories. They were defeats at the hand of Little Turtle's Confederacy. But by this point, William Wells is basically kind of working sort of for the U.S. government. He has a very, as one of our chapters shows, a very contested relationship with Little Turtle. They continue to be friends even after the defeat, even though he's sort of, working for the U.S. at times and working for them. But there were lots of other examples of people like that who could serve as those who exchanged. And similarly, it wasn't uncommon for U.S. People to bring and teach and try to educate indigenous people in English. So there were people who could also serve in that role. Most famously, Joseph Brant, who would lead the Iroquois against the U.S. during the American Revolution.
yeah, so Wells is his son-in-law, in a sense, right? And then some other famous people in this painting, Matt Anthony Wayne, and future President William Henry Harrison is there as well as a young lieutenant in the Virginia militia. So, so I mean, what this says to me, what this shows, what this illustrates is this contestation that's going on, right? Really, this is a picture of a geopolitical moment, right? When you have two groups of people, actually more than two groups, many groups here that are vying for control of territory and kind of working it out, sometimes violently, sometimes not so violently. I think that's another myth, right? The myth is that these folks just got out of the way, either were forced militarily to go out of the way, and that they just kind of gave up and left. That's a myth. We can see this right here. These negotiations taking place, and it happened over a long period of time, right? And at this particular point in history, I mean, what's going on right here? It's even here, it's not, and at this time and place, it's not for certain what's going to happen, right? If you were to ask Matt Anthony Wayne, you know, what's going to be the ultimate outcome of this, I don't know that he would be able to tell you, nor would maybe Little Turtle either. That is, it wasn't just a given, right? It wasn't a given of what was going to happen, even though that's how we think about history, we think about the past. Famous geographer named David Lowenthal wrote a famous phrase, uses a famous phrase: "The past is a foreign country," right? So it's the past is in the past, and so it's hard for us to wrap our heads around it sometimes. And we often think of the past through our own contemporary lenses, so that's one of the myths we're trying to kind of deconstruct is that idea.
So why did you call him Mad Anthony Wayne?
Well, this is the label that he gets partly due to uncharitable biographers, and maybe this portrait is also helpful because who is it that decides like how we think about people? Maybe we have to skip to the legacy here soon. It's whoever these people are who are writing it down, right? And after the American Revolution, people started to accuse Wayne of some of this. And so that name kind of stuck in it. Though a recent biographer and speaker here, Mary Stockwell, 2 years ago said, that's a bad rap. He wasn't insane. He didn't have any psychological breaks. He actually was a much better person than history has suggested. That's at least one biographer's view of it. The other thing I think I want to say about this is that one of the threads of the book, and I think it's important for us to kind of think about, and maybe we're moving on to a different myth, is that it's easy to think about the federal government, the United States government, as either being all-powerful at this time, able to dictate its will on whoever it wants, right? And let me be clear, they are dictating their will in this instance, right? Some of the indigenous people here kind of went to British forts and said, please help us, and they closed their doors because they didn't want to go to war with the United States. So they're kind of left, and this is something of it's a real low moment for the Miami, who interestingly ally with the United States against Tecumseh a decade later. But we can think about the federal government as being able to do whatever it wants, or conversely, we can think about the federal government as being practically useless during this time because it was so darn small, and it was very small, right? I think what we try to suggest in the book, and several of our contributors highlight, is that the federal government is an important presence. It can't dominate its will. It has to negotiate with the people who are on the ground, but it is an important force, right? It is able to shape the conversation in significant and important ways. And it does so in other areas as well. I think I see Rox to the question.
You had mentioned how many, I'll be compliant. So you mentioned how many Native Americans were in the country at that time, approximately 3 million, right?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
How many Europeans and Americans were in the country at that time?
Let's see, the first census was about 3 million, 1790?
I think that's
Is that
about
right?
Right, yeah, something like that, yeah.
But in what's now Ohio, in 1790, there couldn't have been 10,000 people of European descent. And that's probably...
I think that's probably charitable.
That's probably charitable.
There were some French settlements and some other groups that were up near the Great Lakes region and some British settlements. But as we know, Marietta becomes one of the first real settlements. Before that, it's largely trappers, traders, merchants who are kind of moving in. One of the stories of these conflicts that would define the 1790s is the federal government coming in and building forts, right, including forts that would eventually become Cincinnati and the settlement of this region.
Yeah.
Only can really be cleared after that treaty that we just talked about, which sort of opens up and by treaty gives the United States technical control over what it had already claimed before, right? But with that agreement that pushed, with great controversy within indigenous peoples, pushed them to the northwest corner of the state or west to Indiana.
And
that's when settlement really began.
And once that happened, Euro-American settlement flooded into the state. By 1850, there are 2 million people in Ohio, right? So in 1790, there's 10,000 maybe. 60 years later, there's 2 million. And 66% of those 2 million had, according to the 1850 census, had been born in Ohio. So there's a huge population coming in. And so that Treaty of Greenville in 1795 that codified U.S. possession of much of what's now Ohio, set the scene.
Okay, and another question. I'm just trying to get a lay of the land. So you had talked about that there were 7 different language groups. Mm-hmm. But was there a common language? So you can imagine, archaeologists come and they come to New York one day and they're like, oh, wow, look, there's Italian, there's, Chinese, there, all these different languages, but there's a unifying language of English.
Yeah.
At least on the face of it. And so was there a unifying language at the time that all, the Native Americans were using as well?
Well, I know that a lot of those, I'm not an expert on indigenous.
Is there any linguistics?
But I do know that a lot of those different languages were in fact probably just dialects of each other. Like think about the Sioux who inhabited really from Canada all the way to what's now northwest Texas. So there were the Lakota Sioux, and then there were the Black Hills Sioux, and there are all these different bands. And they were unified probably by language, but disunified by dialect, right? The Iroquoian languages, right, were probably quite similar to each other. And so there might have been common languages within the different language groups. But other than that, probably French was probably the first lingua franca, right, in the Northwest Territory.
Yeah, French traders are there. But the other thing I think that your question raises is the significance of, cultures that do not at this time write down their things. Think about what other skill sets you have to develop. I think it's probably fair, and I have encountered some primary sources in which the people who encountered, like Europeans who encountered, are amazed with the linguistic, adaptability of the people that they encounter, who can kind of move back and forward between these groups and find ways to communicate, because that's how you communicate, right? You can't write it all down. You can't use Latin, which in Europe is sort of a common scholarly language that people could share across national borders. You had to be able to adapt to this. You had to be able to discern and decipher and figure out languages at a very quick pace, even before Europeans come there. So all I think kind of interesting and great kind of questions. And one of the things that does set up sort of one of the tragedies of this story in the long term, which is the sort of semi-forced or forced placing of many of these indigenous peoples in these boarding schools, which we know in Canada and in the U.S. could often be quite, you shouldn't speak your language. You can't speak your language. This is something that is something you can't do because that is, quote, uncivilized, right? We're going to teach you how to become civilized, rather than saying, hey, you can do all that, and we want to help teach you English or French or whatever. So. Yeah. Just a few other things, like, the Northwest Ordinance, which we know and is a really important document, is another attempt by the federal government to kind of shape the story. And what is it that we think the Northwest Ordinance did? Like, what does it accomplish in our traditional telling of this?
We always tout education.
Yeah, it's important and rightfully so, right? I mean, one of the chapters in the book highlights the significance of education and the reality of the Northwest Ordinance, which is emblazoned on our gate, bringing in this opportunity for landed education. Now, sadly, the land wasn't that great we are legacies of the reality that it was cheaper for farmers to not pay the rents that OU wanted to have them pay and instead just go down the road to more fertile land and squat and settle that land, right? Which is part of the reason why our endowment and foundation is not as big as it could have been, right? But yeah, so public education is a big one. Yeah, what else? Do we know about the land ordinance and the settling? What do you think about the settling of farming? Certainly is crucial and important. How was that? What was the idea for public education? It was, how is it going to be funded and laid out, and how is the land and farming going to all work?
Rents.
Rents and we think you've seen these grids. It's all going to be laid out in this neat and easy sort of organized way, and that is the intention. So people hoped. It does shape some of the dynamics, but doesn't always work out as planned, right? And in David McCullough's story, you see some of that dynamism, but some of the other attempts further west suggest even more sort of problems and challenges when you had people who were claiming the same land and contestations that were happening over who got that land. And so in some ways, the New England settlement that is nicely portrayed in McCullough's book is exceptional to what the larger story of Ohio settlement could be. One, because New Englanders are down here, right?
Yeah.
When in reality, most New Englanders were up there. And maybe you want to speak towards some of the filling in of this.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the other myths is that that the settlement of the Northwest Territory was kind of unilaterally done by kind of one group of people. If you look at the 1850 census, for example, the first census that asked everyone, enumerated where were you born, at least at the state level or a foreign country level, it's clear that the population was not unified in any way with regard to regional origins. This map is actually, I was going to use the word unique. I wouldn't say unique, but there are very few other places in the country that have a map like this, very few other states. Texas, kind of, a couple of other states perhaps, but Ohio was a place, as Brian highlighted earlier, that has always been this crossroads. So going back in the pre-European peoples, indigenous peoples, but after the Northwest Ordinance, populations flooded across the Ohio River, and they were coming from lots of different places. And so the federal government had to kind of deal with this, right? Federal government, I always like to think of it, had sort of three major problems on its hands right after the Revolution. And one of those big problems was what to do with all this territory, right, that it had won during the Revolution. So
Won but didn't control.
But didn't control, right? So how are we, so in the European mind, what is land? What is land represent? Wealth. Yeah, land is a commodity to be bought and sold, right? So that idea is introduced to North America from the very first Europeans, right? So this map really is a representation of that idea of commodification of the land. So the federal government has to figure out what this land is kind of worth and how we're going to settle it. And these different subdivisions here represent attempts by the federal government to kind of experiment with different ways of alienating the land, right? Alienating the public domain. And what that means is taking the public domain, the territory of the United States, and putting that into the hands of private individuals to farm.
So is this an early form of gerrymandering?
This is kind of an early form of gerrymandering, yeah. So they tried out different forms, right? So you can imagine the first idea was, well, look, land is money, and we're flat broke, right? We just been through the revolution. We owe France a lot of money. We owe, right? And the individual states are flat broke as well, and they owe the new federal government money as well. And so everyone is kind of contesting, trying to figure out what to do with this territory. So the first idea is to let's make it pay. And so let's sell it. So the Ohio Company is a good example of that, right? Basically a joint stock company that formed in Boston. And the idea is we're going to pool our resources. We're going to buy this huge chunk of land from the federal government. We're going to hire a surveyor to survey it in the lots. Then we're going to sell those lots, and we're going to make lots of bucks, right?
This is Manasseh Cutler, Cutler Hall, Bunch of Grapes Tavern.
All of those.
All of those things that are connected here.
Yeah, and
the
so
buildings here are named after.
Exactly, yeah. So
they call it.
Marietta becomes kind of the center of where this is going to happen, and right in the middle of that, they're going to reserve a piece of land for a great university, right, in a town named Athens. Yeah.
So once they sell the land to these companies, is there an expectation that the companies will, pay taxes or anything back to the federal government? Or is it really just we need people to occupy this land so we can say it's ours, it's productive?
I think both.
Yes,
I
both.
think both.
Both
Oh,
is the
okay.
answer.
Yeah.
Both is the answer. And one of the chapters talks a little bit about this.
Yeah.
We're
So-
getting the money for buying it, and then we're going to raise
And we're taking control of
We're
this,
getting
right?
taxes.
So here's the Treaty of Greenville, right, that was signed after that painting. That's the cover of the book. The indigenous populations retreat here, and then very quickly also by 1818, they are forced further west, right? So the Shawnee are forced to what's now northeast Oklahoma, southwest Missouri, et cetera. Yeah, I think we have a map of
I'm
that.
trying to get that one up here. But I think I'm going the wrong direction.
Yeah,
here.
back the other way, yeah.
Oh,
Keep going back.
sorry. Working on it.
That's all right.
There we go.
There we go. Yeah. So, and then, so once those treaties are, they're trumped up treaties in the first place, once those are broken by American settlers, then, those tribes are forced further west. Once this happens, then those lands become part of the public domain as well. That's why on that map they're called Congress lands. And so, yeah, so that, if you want to go back to that map.
I just want to say
Brian.
one thing on this.
Yeah.
Everybody's familiar with the Trail of Tears, but where was the Trail of Tears at? That was in the South. That was in the southern part.
That was from.
That's what happens
That was
here. That's
here.
what all the textbooks talk about. But the thing that I didn't know until I moved to Ohio is actually, what happened to the Indian people who were here? Where did they go? Well, there was an earlier sort of version of the Trail of Tears, right, in which the Shawnee and several other groups were, basically time to get out, right? You can either choose, stay, and assimilate, or if you want to keep your own status, you're going to have to go to this other place west of the Mississippi River, right? And that's what happens, and that's why we brought Chief Gwenna Wallace as one of our speakers here to tell the story of her people.
Yes, she writes the last chapter in the book that tells the story of the Shawnee. The Shawnee eventually wind up, if you look at how much territory they kind of claimed pre-European, in the pre-European period, right? This was a large area. But they end up with, in what's now the northeast corner of Oklahoma, the very northeast corner of Oklahoma, they end up with about, I think it's 160 acres or something like that.
Really minuscule part.
yeah.
And part of that is due to later deals that were meant to provide get protection. But that's one of the sad threads of this story, right? Is how is it that we can kind of think about that story and hold that story in the same view and frame as we do the other stories that our book tells and that McAuliffe's book also tells, which is, this story of European settlement in this area does lead to the displacement of lots of these groups. And should we go to the end?
We
of
could,
this?
yeah, we could, yeah, we could. I mean, if you want to go back to that slide real quick, I'll just mention a couple of other, ideas were to that came, this. You see this Virginia Military District, you see this Connecticut Western Reserve. This represents also a geopolitical reality that the eastern states, the western border of several of the eastern states was by treaty literally the Pacific Ocean. So Connecticut actually by treaty went to the Pacific Ocean. So Connecticut, and Virginia both had a very strong and loud representatives in Congress, in the first Congress. They were able to say, we'll give up our claim to that land in the West in return for reserving that land and the cancellation of our war debt as well. And so what this did is clearly, you can see on this map here, this is by township. Each of these units is townships. This figured into where groups from the East went in Ohio. So if you look at where New Englanders went, a few originally went to Marietta, but not most of them. Most of them went up here. You can see exactly that Connecticut Western Reserve there, right? Virginians, mainly to the Virginia Military District, which was reserved by Virginia for repatriating Revolutionary War veterans. If you were a captain, you got a headright grant patent for 1,000 acres in the military district. And if you could make your way out there and have a surveyor survey you 1,000 acres, and you take that to Chillicothe, the land office, and you own that land. And then Pennsylvanians and other people from the Mid-Atlantic mainly settled kind of in between. And then later on, you've got immigrants coming in, right? Especially German immigrants to a couple different places, especially over here, which was also an area around near Fort Laramie, right? The Wapakoneta, and Wapakoneta was also a Shawnee center. So, right, you've got this map that shows this geopolitical reality that's going on.
And if you can't see it, over 50% of those green areas are foreign-born. Right? That's how dominant the immigration areas were in these regions.
So this is another kind of myth, right, that we're looking to bust or at least deconstruct, is this idea that everyone was the same. But, people from New England had very different ideas about public education than Virginians, than Pennsylvanians, right? A lot of these were Pennsylvania Germans. A lot of them were kind of evangelical Lutheran types. These were Congregationalists. These were Baptists. Lots of different ideas, right? And in fact, it was the Virginians who really were the first movers and shakers in the first government at Chillicothe, right? The first capital was Chillicothe, and like the first governors were all of Virginian ancestry, and they had different ideas about how public education, the role of public education, the role of slavery, right, and all of these things. So this attracted, if you look at maps of where people are coming from, they're coming from all these different places, right, including a large African-American population. So there are several large areas of African-American, rural African-American populations throughout southern Ohio, including Tabletown, what used to be called Kilvert, which is now called Tabletown, just north and east and over in Rome Township in the northeast part of the county. I call these folks multi-ethnic populations because they are. There's African ancestry, there's European ancestry, and there's indigenous ancestry for in fact, almost all of these areas that are shown on this map. And so they're here from the very beginning as well. That's another myth, right? That there weren't any black people in Ohio. When we think about the black population of Ohio, we think, we know a lot about the urban populations in Cincinnati and Columbus and Cleveland, Dayton, but really look at the dates here, right? Some of these date from 1819, right? And that's just nearby. These African-American settlers in Northeast Athens County were some of the very first in the state.
And that is because the Northwest Ordinance, the other thing we probably remember about it is that slavery was prohibited. That did not mean equality. In fact, it led in some cases to black laws that prevented equality, but it created something of a safe haven for people either freeing enslavement or freeing worse discrimination in the Northeast to find some degree of a subsistence there. And the back of the book has a census information, an appendix that has different African Americans that have been found in different communities that future people can research, because until some of the stuff that's in this book, people haven't really thought about that. It's been what people have forgotten about the settlement of Ohio, right? History is not just about what we remember. Sometimes it's about what we forget, and reclaiming and thinking about the things that we've forgotten. And so I think if we were thinking about this book, it's in part meant to sort of provide an opportunity for people to continue the discussion that we know, modify it in ways where it's erroneous, but also try to remember that Ohio has always, from its very beginning, been a remarkably diverse place that has created a rich cultural landscape of lots of different groups of people, right? And also a place in which contestation has happened, also a place in which violence has been at times a defining feature of it. Are there other questions, or are we out? How are we on time, Howard?
About another minute or two.
Okay.
Roxy's got another question for us.
She wants more.
Y'all can jump in, otherwise I'm going to keep going. So I did hear you use the word Indian over and over again, and I guess I have been trained, rightly or wrongly, to begin to say Native American. So I'm curious, why are you using the term Indian?
Or you mean indigenous?
Well, I use the term Indian, and I'll say this is, as you might imagine, has been at times a hotly contested issue. There was a polling that was done about 10 or 15 years ago that the recognized federally, as I understand it, the federally recognized groups about what the preferred term was. And ironically, Indian was one of the ones that rose to the top of that discussion. And so it is, at least in scholarly circles, it has been seen as a more appropriate, or at least as appropriate term as Native American. But
Indigenous is also a term.
is increasingly a more common term, which I think you've heard us both use, in part because it illustrates not just the experience of those people who lived here prior to European contact, but also is applicable to other societies where there are similar groups of people. So,
Sure.
yes, Jeff.
Yeah, I had is this thing on? You hear? Okay. I had a question about the legacy of treaties and the intent of the U.S. government, and whether these things were actual land grabs, or whether there was actually an effort to make a deal, to say, can we have this land in exchange for whatever, you guys move here, we'll give you this. And from my reading, which is limited, my understanding is that it was very difficult because there were so many different outfits who were negotiating. They weren't always clear who was in charge. There was the notion, of course, that Native Americans didn't necessarily treat land in this way, but also that the Westerners who showed up, this way of documenting a sale or a treaty was their best way to sort of legitimize this movement and the sort of so I guess the real question is, what is the legacy of treaties, and does it really put the U.S. government in a bad light or not?
You want to tackle that one?
Thanks.
I think one of the legacies.
I will only give you 1 minute.
Okay. I would say yes, 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 and yes, right? There are so many different treaties, and some of them were clearly, I would say, the treaty commissioners came in with the intent of trying to defraud indigenous people, right? And there's examples famous of like getting groups drunk, intentionally sort of mistranslating things. So that is clearly a part of what this story is. Is that always the story? I think probably there are instances in which there was a better, more genuine intent to try to come up with something that would be seen and understood fairly. If no reason else, then it would avoid further wars that would be costly and problematic. But that doesn't end up playing out that way because you can sign a treaty. Are you going to enforce the treaty? It's easier to enforce the treaty against people who can't vote for you than it is against the settlers who you know do vote for you. And so that's, even when, I guess I would say, even when there was a legitimate, sincere effort to be made, things often broke down for a wide variety of reasons, amongst them cultural misunderstanding.
All right. Let's thank Professor Anderson, Professor Schoen for an enlightening discussion today.
Thank you all so much for coming.
And if you are dying to have a T-shirt, I have T-shirts still.
And I think
once
we
again,
need to make sure that
and
people
the
are aware
books.
that Nick has
Yes,
come with
Nick's
some
here.
copies of books, and
So-
if people want them signed, we're happy to do that too.
So please see Nick, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you.